All right, so welcome everyone. I'm very happy that all of you have joined us today. We have folks online as well for this lecture by Swati Janu. I think all of you know me, but in case you're one of the few in the room who don't, my name is Gregory Randolph. I'm one of the newest faculty members here at SCARP. I do a lot of work on urbanization through the lens of labor and migration, and I've had the privilege through my own research and practice of interacting with Swati for over a decade now. So we've been friends for a long time. Just wanted to thank SCARP for making this guest lecture possible, especially Say, Yoshioka Follow, Josh Wilt, who was just here, Anna Kirkova, and of course our chair, Ulsha. So today Swati is going to give her lecture for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes afterward for Q&A. If you're watching online, you should be able to type your questions into the Q&A, and I'll be sort of fielding questions at that point. So I'm really excited about today's lecture for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it's an opportunity to sort of bring together people from across the College of Design. We have a strong and cohesive college, but we don't always get the chance to engage with one another intellectually. And I think that today's speaker, because she really works at the intersection of several different design fields, presents that opportunity. So she'll be talking a lot about her work in community engagement and planning processes. But I think, as you'll see, because of her training as an architect and her really creative ways of thinking about design, she also sort of stitches together multiple disciplines within our school. And the other reason I'm excited is because Swati's work is really inspiring. I find it really inspiring, and I think you will as well. It's been a privilege to watch her practice really grow and evolve over the last 10 or 15 years. And Swati's really thinking about issues that we think about here in Atlanta of urban inclusion, housing rights, participatory planning and design. But she's thinking about them in contexts that I would argue present even greater barriers to inclusion. And despite that, she's working toward those goals in a way that I think is very hopeful and creative and even at times playful. So thank you so much, Swati, for being here. And I'm going to just give, before I turn it over to you, I'm going to give a formal introduction of you so that everyone here knows about your work. So Swati Janu is an architect and artist who's based in Delhi, and she works on inclusion in the built environment, from gender parity in public spaces to housing rights. She was recently awarded the Moira Emil Prize for Emerging Architecture, which is a very prestigious honor in the architecture world. And when she won, the judges wrote that Janu captures the presence of an absence, redrawing the map to make local lives visible. She is a facilitator, showing that the architect has a place alongside human rights lawyers, activists, and community leaders. The judges noted that Swati's work is evidence that it's okay for architects not always to build, but to support people who are already built. Swati is the founder of an interdisciplinary urban practice called the Social Design Collaborative that works towards spatial justice in Indian cities. Her approach combines grassroots activism with policy advocacy, for which she regularly works as a technical consultant on inclusive urbanism. She's a graduate from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, and she also holds a Master of Science in Sustainable Urban Development from the University of Oxford. So Swati, welcome virtually to Georgia Tech and the College of Design, and we're so excited to hear from you.
Wow, what an introduction. I'm also slightly emotional. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for your patience with the setting up. It is, well, it's quite late here in India, but I'm really glad for this opportunity to, well, share some notes, compare some notes, talk to you, and also learn from the American context. So I'm going to jump straight into my presentation. And Craig asked me to begin by talking a bit about my city, the capital city of India, the city of Delhi. And how do you talk about a city which has a population of 33 million? Just to put things into perspective, New York has a population of 19 million people. So Delhi is really huge. But perhaps in a room full of planners or students who are studying planning, perhaps talking about different urban fabrics, the diverse urban fabrics that make the city is a good way to start. So this is a typical view of the central part of Delhi, which is called Lutyens Delhi. Now, Edward Lutyens was a very lucky architect, British architect, who got to design the colonial city of Delhi. Now, India has been under the colonial rule of the British for over 200 years. And Delhi was the capital city towards the end. And Edward Lutyens designed this part of the city, and today, well, we remember the city. I mean, we've named the city, locally speaking, after the architect. So we just refer to it as Lutyens Delhi. And of course, in typical British planning, sort of an approach, you can see it's made up of promenades and vistas, a lot of geometric sort of planning. Very different from the old city of Delhi, which was designed and built by the Mughals, much more organically and incrementally. Also, Delhi is said to be a city of seven cities. There are said to be seven historic cities in the entire precinct of Delhi. So over time, at different places in Delhi, different dynasties built different cities, and Old Delhi is one of those. But most of Delhi looks something like this, which is self-built, designed and built themselves, built by the residents themselves. So only 30% of Delhi, of 30% of housing in Delhi is what is called planned. And so the other 70% is what are called informal settlements or unplanned, quote unquote, unplanned settlements. But actually they have been designed and planned by the residents themselves. Now, why is that? So according to the work that we do, we believe that this is because of inadequate planning measures, huge planning gaps, which have led to an acute shortage of affordable housing, of adequate housing. A few years back, the number in the country for the shortage of affordable housing stood at 18 million households. So I was telling you about the population of New York, which is 19 million people. These are 18 million households that we're talking about. So you can multiply it by 5. And you can see the extent of the gap when it comes to adequate housing in the country. So in big cities like Delhi, what do when you can't find housing that you can afford? You build your own housing, right? And actually, these settlements need to be seen as a self-made solution and not really encroachments or a problem or an ISO even that the planning authorities need. The planning authorities typically view it as. So a large part of the work that we do is also about influencing this discourse on how informal settlements are viewed in Indian cities across the global south, in fact. And informal settlements are of different kinds. Now they range from what are called squatter settlements or colloquially referred to as slums to unauthorized colonies to urban villages. And I'm not going to go into details of different kinds of informal settlements, but I just want to share that a large part of these informal settlements are also considered illegal because they fall outside the purview of planning processes. So 30% of housing in Delhi, for example, is considered illegal because people live in slums, quote unquote slums. And actually, when you look at the statistics, you realize that it's only on 3% of the land. So when 30% of the people in a city are living on 3% of the land, I mean, that's really like something we also need to understand when we refer to them as encroachers or we call these settlements illegal. Perhaps the problem is in our definition of what is considered legal and illegal. And so these are the kind of conversations that we try to have. And so the spatial inequalities in our cities manifest themselves in this way. This is a photograph from Mumbai, where I am currently right now. I'm not in Delhi. And the sort of disparity between what is considered planned on the top and what is considered unplanned, which is the bottom of the picture, which is a slum, is basically the fundamental premise. I mean, it's basically, I think, what the planners need to relook at. And also, I want to bring in here how spatial inequalities manifest themselves in the global north, just to draw parallels and also to compare. So, of course, you are aware of the 10 cities and, well, cities such as San Francisco and growing homelessness when it comes to unhoused people. And they're just different forms of the same spatial inequality, of course, brought about by the neoliberal, sort of economic order that we live in, which you are also well aware of, I'm sure. And so coming back to India, this has led to what I refer to as bulldozer urbanism, because our cities are sort of caught in this loop of people building their housing, the planning authorities demolishing their housing, and people rebuilding their housing, because also at the same time, there are service providers in our cities, right? These are the people who run the city, who clean the city, who build the city. They are construction workers, farmers, street vendors, waste pickers, and so the people are coming in large numbers from our villages, and 70% of India is said to be living in the villages. So people are coming in large number from our villages to the bigger cities for livelihoods, and there is a need for those services. But when it comes to providing adequate housing, that is something that we fail to do, and we keep demolishing the housing that people have built themselves. So really, these informal settlements are being built to be rebuilt and exist in a state of ephemerality and precarity, which keeps people in a perpetual cycle of poverty, making it hard for them to be upwardly mobile. And so, just a very short sort of a crash course into informal settlements for some of you that might be relatively new. So I just wanted to make sure that I cover that. And also to talk a bit about my own background. So I've been trained as an architect, as Greg also mentioned. And for the first few years, I was working in what we call mainstream architecture. But over time, I was designing, student housing, universities, etc. But over time, I started wondering about what is the role and relevance of an architect in such a context when most of the housing is built by the people themselves. And so, can my skills not be more useful in supporting the kind of architecture that is happening in informal settlements when compared to just building for, well, the elite, just for a few who can afford the services of an architect or a planner? And so, because of this sort of quarter life crisis, I started working with a social enterprise called Micro Home Solutions, where I also met Greg. And then since then, yeah, we've been just doing this kind of work in the development sector, in the social sector, at the intersection of community engagement and policy advocacy and planning. And I'm going to share a few examples with you. So coming back to the eviction process, this is a sketch which has been drawn by one of my students. And what they were trying to show is what a typical eviction looks like. Very often the evictions themselves are illegal because planning authorities need to follow due process when it comes to evicting people. They need to give 1 month's notice. They need to make sure there is a rehabilitation. There is another house or a plot of land that people are allotted housing in before they remove their original housing. So none of these things get followed. And suddenly bulldozers arrive, often in the morning, early hours of the morning. And so people scramble to form two kinds of groups. One group is helping the women and the children and sort of packing up all their belongings. And the other group is negotiating with the authorities, sort of like really planting themselves in front of the bulldozers. But by the end of the day, a large part of the settlement is broken, is demolished. Of course, a lot of NGOs are involved, a lot of activists, social workers, human rights lawyers who try to stop this process. But Delhi is really caught in this sort of perpetual cycle of demolition and rebuilding. And so what some of us did a few years back is we tried to archive all the forced evictions which have been taking place in the city. And a bunch of us, academics, activists, social workers, architects, journalists, filmmakers, came together as a voluntary sort of an initiative to create this online archive. It's called missingbasti.com. It's a website which archives around 300 evictions which have taken place in Delhi over the last 30 years. So the choice of colors is also deliberate. It's sort of like a negative print of a city, which shows what has gone missing. So the project is called Missing Basti, where Basti is a Hindi word for a self-built neighborhood. And in many cases, people didn't even know that these neighborhoods existed, leave alone the fact that they've gone missing. So it became really important for us to share their stories. And some of these bigger points are they have a bit more information, the oral histories from different people we spoke to. Right now, the map is down in the website I was checking. So we are trying to get that fixed. In fact, I see a message from the web developer. But this is all work in progress. Unfortunately, we have to add about 20, 25 evictions every year. And you also see some coronavirus shaped points. Now, these are evictions which have taken place during COVID. And the points in red are the forced evictions, and the points in yellow are the resettlement sites. And so, if you look at the different waves of resettlement which have taken place in Delhi, you see that the poor have been structurally pushed out of the city, right? From more sort of inner core areas of the city to more peripheral areas in the city. And here I also want to draw a parallel between what has historically taken place in American cities. Many of you might be familiar with the concept of redlining, where American cities have been restructured deliberately along lines of racial segregation. And I think it's very important to be cognizant of these forces which have reshaped our cities and how we can stop it or even begin to reverse it. And so I want to move to the case the process that we have been a part of over the last few years, which has been our engagement with the farmers along the river Yamuna in Delhi. Now, Delhi is one of the very few cities in the world to still have farming at the heart of the city. So, of course, when places urbanize, agriculture goes away from the cities, right? I mean, cities historically came up on banks of rivers, but today with urbanization, agriculture does not take place within cities anymore. But there are some cities, especially in the global south, though I've also heard of some European cities introducing agriculture, back into the urban centers. But in the global south, agriculture still remains in certain urban centers, and Delhi is one of those cities where 10% of our vegetables actually come from the farms along the river Yamuna. So we have been working with the farmers along the river in these floodplains. And today the farmers are considered as encroachers and they've been facing regular evictions. But in the past, post-independence, they were allowed to farm in a legitimate way. So I just want to quickly cover the story of how legitimate sort of tenants became illegitimate over time. So post-independence, a farmers cooperative was formed and short-term leases were being given out by the Delhi Development Authority, which is the planning authority in Delhi. 5-year leases were being given out to farmers and they were paying their rents. But over time, over a few decades, as the imagination of the planning authorities changed to being more world-class, they decided to discontinue farming along the banks of the river and to shift to more public spaces and biodiversity parks and running tracks and jogging tracks. And I think these are good visions as well, but not at the cost of livelihoods which are linked to the river, such as fishing and farming. So what happened is while the short-term leases were stopped by the government, the farmers continued to farm because the farming cooperative continued collecting rent. And once the cooperative was dissolved, by then some middlemen had stepped in and they were charging rent. So the farmers actually continued paying rent, but the rent was not going to the government. And this has happened over like 50 years. And today, as a result, they're considered encroachers. They were never involved in any of the development plans, any of those processes, and they've been facing forced evictions. So much so that they have changed their nature of crop cycles. While they were growing things like corn, which might take 6 months for harvest, now they only grow ladies' fingers, okra, which might just take 2 months because there's an eviction and your entire crop is bulldozed. But very slowly and consistently, they are being actively removed. And in one of these demolitions a few years back, a school was demolished. Just quickly going back to the map. So this is the area that I'm talking about. And a school for the children of farmers was demolished in 2016. And some of the people there had approached me through an activist, and they knew that as an architect, I worked in this domain, and they asked for help to rebuild their school because they got permission to rebuild it with the clause that it had to be temporary. And so we decided to build a school that could be dismantled before bulldozers arrive, because typically at least you get 1 day or 2 days notice to kind of pack up your belongings. And so we had to design the school in such a way that it could be quickly unbolted and stored, and then rebuilt when the bulldozers left. So that's what we did. This was in 2017. And for me, it changed a lot of things, because what happened is a lot of architectural students and a lot of architects and young professionals joined forces with us as volunteers to help build the school. And that really snowballed into a larger sort of a movement. And I think that has been the inception of Social Design Collaborative for us, really. This is what the school looked like from inside. But after a year of the school operating from its original location, we had to relocate it because it was just not possible to continue, being there because of land tenure issues. And so the school had to be relocated, sadly, and also like very symbolically outside the city, because there was no space within the city for it. It was still further down the river. And this is what the process of dismantling the school and rebuilding looked like. But this did not take place simultaneously. This was over a few months. This is just a representation of what that process looked like. And at the new location, we also the architecture had basically used the same building technologies and materials that people were already building in at the first location, and again at the second location. And at the second location, there were a lot of craftspeople who make these kind of beds called charpai, which means like a cot. And so we introduced this sort of weaving also into the architecture, which also brought a lot of recognition to the school, because of how it looked, and a lot of pride and ownership in the local community because their crafts were integrated into the architecture of the school. So I'm not going to go into the design of the school as such, but I just want to talk about it to say what happened next, because over time, what we realized is that the school that we helped build was a band-aid solution, right? Because school was demolished, so we helped rebuild it. But it was really important to kind of step back, zoom out, and also look at it at an urban scale and question why farmers are being evicted in the first place. Why are schools being demolished when we have something called the right to education in our country? And so we started studying the different plans that the planning authorities had made. And also we started mapping the extent of the farmland along the floodplains. And so from 2000, when the first satellite imagery was available online, which actually in recent months has been taken away, like historic satellite imagery in India is down. And I'm not going to comment on why that has happened. But there is a lot of censorship on data now in India. Anyway, so you can see that it has reduced from covering half the floodplains to just 1/3. And actually, this is 2020. And just over the last 3 years, most of the farmlands have been removed. So we were looking at this in 2020 and 2021, and we realized that there is not a lot of data in the public domain when it comes to planning authorities' proposals, development proposals. So we got a lot of it in a very investigative style from different sources, from journalists, from different news articles. And when we started sort of like jigsaw puzzles, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, when we started sort of superimposing them on the map of the city, we started realizing what are the different neighborhoods which would be displaced, different villages which would be displaced because of these plans. So you can see this very beautiful landscape plan drawn by, I'm sure, someone from my university in Delhi, displaces these red dots. These red dots are the villages of the farmers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these villages, and so on and so forth. And we got in touch with the community leaders of the different villages. And we also tried to work out how we could come up with proposals, like sort of a rethinking, a reimagination of these parts of the city, where instead of just criticizing the government, what we also wanted to say is, hey, let's think together. Can we come up with an integrated vision where you don't have to remove farms to build parks? We can have both. It would be so nice if we also had a jogging track, while you also had farms. So can we think of these sort of like integrated visions? And at the same time, in 2021, the master plan for Delhi, the master plan for 2041 also was slated to come out. So master plans are plans of cities which come out either every 10 years or 15 years or 20 years in India. and I'm sure like across cities in the world. But from what Greg was telling me, I think in the American context, they're more of strategic plans now and not really like master plans, which is a bit of a dated concept. And in any case, who's this master who's designing for us all? And why is he a guy? Anyway, so we have master plans every 20 years in Delhi, which is a very long pause. And the master plan for 2041 came out, of course, in 2021, but there was 3 to 4 years of development of that plan. And while that development was happening, the civil society, the different NGOs and community-based organizations in Delhi, we mobilized ourselves to make sure that the government took feedback from people, because the last 3 master plans had not really taken feedback from the people. They have processes where we are able to give our feedback, but they were really tokenist. They were sort of like online forms that we could fill, and no one was really reading those forms. There was no accountability. There was no way of knowing that your feedback would really be taken. And so about 40 plus organizations, we mobilized ourselves to form a campaign called Main Bhi Delhi, which stands for I Am Delhi Too. And the idea was to hold the planning authority accountable, but also work with the planning authorities, work as a bridge perhaps between the different communities, diverse communities on ground, as well as the master planning, the master planning forces. So we worked with the farmers along the river to understand what their needs are, what their concerns are that needed to be communicated to the Delhi Development Authority. And they were as simple as, let's integrate the riverfront with farming. Agriculture needs to be notified as a dedicated land use. Farmers need reskilling if you want them to switch to organic practices, etc. And a large part of this work also involved making sure that what is in the master plan for the residents of the city is actually understood by the residents of the city. And so for that, as a part of the campaign, we designed a toolkit to sort of like demystify the master plan, to sort of like deconstruct it and to make it more, to translate it into something that people could understand. And so the toolkit is called Kaun Hai Master Kya Hai Plan, which is who is the master, what's the plan? And we translated or sort of like distilled the different chapters in the master plan into different activities. Now, the master plan is a 500-page document. And even for a planner, for an architect, it takes us days to go through it, to understand it. So you can imagine what it is for, just a regular resident who hasn't had architectural or planning training. And so it was very important for us to also make it as playful as possible, as accessible as possible. And this is what went into the design of it. These are the 3 previous land use plans from the 3 previous master plans. So it was also very important for us to communicate to people how the city has changed, how the planning has changed across these master plans, across the last 60 years, and what is in store now. And we used, simple cards, activity cards, and the entire toolkit was based on a map, because now the master plan speaks the language of the map, right? So it became really important for us to also understand and speak the same language. And so the entire toolkit was based on this large map of the city. Also, just to explain the Indian context a bit, maps are intimidating to people. They can be an alien sort of a medium. Because there's a huge digital barrier in the Indian context. A lot of people don't have digital access. They don't use Google Maps. They don't use maps regularly. And so when you don't understand something, it can be really intimidating. So it was important for us to make it like a huge bed sheet that you could sort of like crawl over, sit on, interact with, and just becomes a bit less alien that way. Or we could just we pinned it up sometimes on the wall. And then they were like simple activities involving people voting. So we used bindis, which are like these stickers that Indian women wear on their forehead if they're Hindu and in the northern part of India. And we held consultations using this toolkit. And when I say we, I mean actually a whole collective of grassroots organizations, not just Social Design Collaborative, but a whole host of organizations, and some 100 consultations were held across the city with waste pickers, with home-based workers, with construction workers, with farmers, to help them understand what is in the master plan for them, how does it affect them directly. So this was held on the streets. Here, again, you can see it's like a small group on the street, in parks, in people's homes. This was also a time when COVID was around, and so you can see a lot of masks, a lot of online sort of discussions as well because of that. And finally, about 30,000 feedback forms were filled, about 30,000 objections were filed in response to the master plan. And just to give you an idea of the scale of that engagement, when it came to the online platform, less than 5,000 registrations were made online. Now, these were 5,000 registrations. We don't know how many people actually filed feedback forms after they registered online. But when it came to physical, offline sort of filling of forms, there were 30,000. And again, in the Indian context, this actually works better for people, like going in person to the office of the planning authority. I'm guessing in the American context, maybe it's flipped, because I was speaking to someone from Canada and they were saying that actually the digital sort of interaction would be much, much more than the physical interaction. But in our case, the physical interaction works because people can just take a bus and go to the office of the planning authority, as opposed to actually downloading an app and figuring out how to interact with it. And so this is a group of women who were protesting outside the planning authority's office, and they wanted to be heard. They went with the land use map of their own neighborhood to talk about what they wanted to change in the master plan that affected them directly. And so I'm really happy to share that we had a small win because of that. And for the first time in the history of master plans in Delhi, farming was identified as a permissible activity along the floodplains. So that was, that was great. But at the same time, we have to also remember that the master plan is a policy document. It lays down the guidelines for what can be done, but doesn't really directly impact what has been happening. The development plans which have been made and have been in motion for years are very, very hard to challenge, to try to rethink. And as a result, the evictions continued. And we also realized that we need a diversity of approaches, right? So engaging with the master plan is one, building a school maybe as a stopgap solution is one, artistic engagement became another sort of a process for us to engage with the farmers, especially women. And I say women because we also decided to work actively with women. We are mostly, an organization with a lot of women in our organization, and this has just happened naturally over time. And also because when it comes to decision making in communities, it's always the men who are in the foreground, and so we realized over time that we needed to kind of make the extra effort, like take the extra step of going into people's homes and working with the women, making sure that their voices are heard, their needs and concerns are represented as well. So we started a few mapping activities with the women farmers. And we also, these were sort of like what we call mental mapping, cognitive mapping, where you're drawing your neighborhood as you see it. And in the process, people are also learning about their own neighborhood from them, also the different crops they grow and what are different cycles of harvesting them, and where does this fresh produce grow? Where does this fresh produce go? And so these were the different vegetables we realized were farmed along the river. And these were the different animals, the different cattle that were herded along the river. And we also mapped the connections of the vegetables, the fresh produce to the different markets across the city. And the women, what they started doing is they started stitching a map of their own neighborhood as they saw it, of their own farms and their own villages, to communicate to the rest of the city. Because what also happens is they are seen as encroachers, also because of a huge class and caste-based prejudice, right? And so it was really important for them to spread public awareness, to help the residents, the rest of the city, actually understand what their contribution to the city is in terms of food security. When borders were shut down, the city borders were shut down during COVID, the people who were living along the river had fresh produce, they had vegetables. And so farmers are bringing that kind of food security to the city, which many of us don't recognize and we don't acknowledge. And so what they did is they created a public art exhibition of the map they had created and a few other infographics that we had created with them. And they also conducted walks along the river. So we call this campaign Chalo Yamuna, this is the logo, which means let's go to the Yamuna, let's go to the river. And these were led by different community leaders, where the women took the residents who signed up on the weekends, either Saturday morning or Sunday morning. They took them to the river to ask them what kind of a riverfront do you want, which is a kind of question that planning authorities typically never ask the residents. And it became important for the farmers to ask the residents, do they want these farms to be gone, to build jogging tracks, for this place to be gentrified, or would you rather have a sort of an integrated space which belongs to everyone, which also supports their livelihoods, which supports other riverine livelihoods. However, the evictions continued, and despite our efforts, and a lot of farmers that we worked with have been removed from their farms have been demolished, and they have moved to the periphery of the city. But our efforts continued as well. And so the next thing we did is we mapped the villages along the river, because we realized that the villages were also being removed, because it's very easy to remove something when it's not even on the map, right? So when you look at the map of the floodplains, a large part is shown as white. It's just blank space. They don't really show the people who are on the ground. And so if we really want to ask for the rights, or we want to ask for resettlement, then at least we should be able to show that, hey, we are here, we are on the map. And so we took up a 9-month exercise where we worked with different community leaders along the 22-kilometer stretch of the river. And we started mapping the different villages, the extent of their farms, using a very simple app developed by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. It's free, it's for everyone. It's called Kobo Toolbox. And so we did a lot of trainings where different people took charge of different areas. And as a result, we were able to map 56 villages along the 22-kilometer stretch of the river in the city. We did a public launch of our findings, that over 9,000 households live on Yamuna floodplains. They need to be rehabilitated instead of being removed. We also shared this with the planning authorities. However, the evictions continue. So the latest, now this news article, when we launched it, was 2022, March. And this is, well, the latest. This is February this year. And in fact, it talks about the G20 summit. You might know the G20 nations. America is one of them. Then there is EU, there is Saudi Arabia, and Russia. And so, well, all the, I think, a lot of powerful economies. And so the G20 summit just happened in Delhi in September, just now. And as a result, and this is really common, it happens all the time across the global south, perhaps the global north as well. Anytime there's a mega event in the name of beautification, what happens is that a lot of neighborhoods are demolished because they're considered eyesores. Street vendors are removed. Well, recently, street dogs were also removed. And that is the sort of like a knee-jerk reaction to any mega event, right? Instead of actually looking at it at a systemic level and trying to address the different gaps that we face. So that is the latest. A large part of the farms have been removed, and there are very few areas now with farmers or farming left. But I don't want to end on a depressing note. I promised Greg that I wouldn't do that. Actually, I've also had a lot of time over the past few months to internalize this, to think about this. And what I realize is that, I mean, if you're doing this kind of work, which is very hard, it's very challenging, you also need to learn to step back. And it's not just because of your privilege that you can step back. It's also important to understand how movements can sustain and how such struggles can have a life of their own. And so maybe it might not have worked in a certain place at a certain time, but it will work at another place at another time. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. It might work in, I mean, these efforts might work in another city in India or another city in the global south, or in fact, even, this sort of an exchange between us is a way of creating a sort of a network of solidarity, right? I mean, all of you might be from different countries across the world. And I think it's really like on us, what kind of professionals we are going to be. If you're talking about planning and architecture, the planners and the architects are really the troublemakers. If you think about it, we are like a large part of the problem. So when we go back, when we become professionals, when we do the kind of work that we hope to do in the future, can we keep spatial justice? Can we keep equity at the core of our efforts and try to do slightly better? So on that hopeful note, I'm going to conclude. I think we have used up our 40 to 45 minutes.
Can you hear us, Swati?
Yes, I can hear you.
So thank you so much. I think you've emphasized the importance of perseverance for planners who are interested in social justice. And I'm excited now to sort of open this up and make it a little bit more interactive. You have a captive audience here that's excited to ask you more about your work and context where you work. I wanted to start, since we have our dean with us, Dean Bassett, I wanted to start with her to see if there's anything you wanted to ask him, Swati.
This isn't about rank. I'm just sitting next to him. Well, I just want to say thank you very much for the talk. And I was reflecting that you probably don't know my background, but I worked in Kenya. I work in the global south, Kenya and Uganda, on very similar issues, especially land tenure. So I'm a little depressed because I've been thinking about these issues for almost 40 years now. And we seem to still be kind of in the same place, which is daunting. Could you just explain a little bit about two aspects? One is, how is land tenure set in Indian cities? Because Delhi was, as you said, the British capital. Is it leasehold? Are there multiple forms of getting security of tenure? And have you guys worked on those questions with the authorities to give legal recognition to their rights to the land?
Sure. You said you had two questions?
Oh, the second one is essentially about the state of the Yamuna. So my understanding is that's a very troubled river, right? That it is actually quite toxic. And so I was wondering if you saw any synergies with the environmental justice or cleaning up the river type movements as you focused on that particular constituency.
Yeah, well, both are very good questions, and I'm really happy that I'm able to explain a bit further. So thank you for that. I'll start with the second question first.
Sure.
So you're absolutely right. The river is heavily polluted, and that's also something which has, acted against our efforts, because people are like, hey, but I mean, we are getting cancer because of the vegetables which are being grown there. And so also we realized that it was very important for us to also bust a few myths. Because yes, the river is polluted, but at the same time, lots of tests were conducted, which show that, so the floodplains are really wide, they're like 1 to 2 kilometer wide. And so there might be some farms right along the river who might be using the water from the river, but most of them are using groundwater, like 99%. And a lot of tests have been conducted which show that the vegetables they're growing are not polluted. They don't have the chemicals in them, which 1% or maybe like 5% might have in them. And I think it became really important for us to sort of also create this sort of separation for people to, I think, not just dismiss it in one go. But at the same time, it is true that these are very, it's a very tricky, it's a very difficult context to operate in. And at the same time, I think from a human rights perspective, the city has polluted the river, and why should the farmers pay the price for it, right? Why should they bear the brunt? But the farmers have been really open to switching to horticulture, to growing marigold flowers, to growing, other sort of ornamental flowers. A lot of them are actually nursery farmers. They don't grow vegetables, they grow ornamental plants in like a huge scale. And they've also asked for support to switch to organic farming, because many people say, oh, you're introducing pesticides back into the river, etc. But they need support for that. And the thing is, also, if they do organic farming, there are not enough customers in the market to buy vegetables which are not perfect looking. So actually, it requires an orchestrated effort at all levels. But yeah, I completely hear you. It's a very contentious sort of a space to work in, and a lot of environmentalists then are not, they're not aligned to what we're talking about. They see farmers perhaps also as a problem. And I think there we also need to have a conversation on what we call bourgeois environmentalism, right? So environmentalism for who? And unless you can also bring I mean, not just environmental sustainability, but also social sustainability in terms of livelihoods that are associated with the river. Unless you bring that also into the picture, I mean, it's a very unequal, sort of an approach. But yes, multiple stakeholders, very contentious. And going to the first question, yes, so land tenure is a very important layer to this entire conversation. So in the different informal settlements that I had mentioned, all of them have land tenures of different natures. So just to give you an idea of the spectrum in Delhi, and it could be very different in a city like Mumbai, which is also a big Indian city. So in Delhi, we have JJ clusters, Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, which are the squatter settlements, which absolutely, have no land tenure. They're considered illegal because they exist on public land like forest land or railway land or even the metro land. And even in that, there are like different subdivisions. There are some of them which are on a list. The government has a list of 675 slums, and we work in slums which are not even on the list. And so, it's a very different sort of a precarity that they both face. Then there are unauthorized colonies, which actually the land belongs to people. They have land titles. But they are not following the land use according to the master plan. So the master plan might say that it's agricultural land, but they have built housing on it. It's their land, but it's yellow color according to land use and not green, and so they're considered unauthorized. And so then there's a whole process of getting them regularized, which has happened to many such settlements, always before an election. But at the same time, they never lose the tag of unauthorization. They're called regularized unauthorized colonies, so they never sort of lose that tag. And then, of course, you have urban villages where people own that piece of land, but at the same time, the city regulations don't apply on them. So yeah, so there is freehold, sort of a land tenure as well. But then there is a whole spectrum of land tenures. So the resettlement colonies, for instance, might just be given as plots to people for just 5 years now. In the past, the plots were given for 99 years, which decreased to 25 years to 10 years, and now it's just 5 years. And in many of these settlements, people are purchasing and purchasing and selling property through power of attorneys. So it's a lot of gray with like lots of different layers, as you yourself pointed out.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, David, and because the speaker's here, you're gonna have to either speak loudly or come up to the front.
Great talk. You mentioned this as a movement. How do the efforts that you talked about in Delhi, how do they compare to what other cities on the subcontinent are doing? Are there other places that are taking a lead on this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I am a big believer in movements and collectives and organizing, the power of organizing. I think in American cities, I mean, from my American friends, what I understand is like you're able to engage with political parties, at the kind of level that in India, we just don't. I mean, for us, like politics is very separate from policy advocacy and planning. But I think in American cities, I mean, there is, I'm such a big fan of like the sort of the organizing work that happens. But coming back to India, so the civil society is very strong in Indian cities, especially Delhi and Mumbai, because, well, the government doesn't do its job and there's a huge gap. So someone has to sort of plug that. And so when we did this campaign, the Main Bhi Delhi, the I Am Delhi 2 campaign, when we organized ourselves, it was based on the lessons from Mumbai. So Mumbai had already done a campaign like that. So we had connected with people, with representatives from that. And now Chennai, another city in India, is undergoing master planning process. So we are exchanging notes with them. So really like collectives are learning from each other. But I think anything that I have managed to do really in the last 15 years is because of the power of collectives. And the way this organizing happens is, to give you an example, like during COVID in 2021, the Supreme Court passed an order saying that all the slums on railway land in Delhi, there are about 48,000 households on railway land. All of them will be demolished because they're on railway land. And so immediately we created a campaign called Railway Sangharsh Morcha. Greg would understand because Greg speaks very good Hindi, which means that just the struggle of people on railway land. And because of like our efforts, collective efforts, again, the Supreme Court order was stopped. That decision did not go ahead because of the huge public outcry which was created because of our efforts. But at the same time, recently 10,000 households were demolished last year, and despite like really strong efforts, we couldn't stop it. But again, I see the youth having gone through that 1 year of understanding what organizing is. And all of those young people who've been a part of the struggle have started their own NGOs now. They've started their own sort of like micro movements. In Indian mythology, if I can just quickly say, I think we are like Rakshas, Greg, we are like the demons, like the Asuras. It's also caste based, what I'm talking about, because Asuras are considered sort of outside the caste system. And it's like there is a tale of, every time you cut this demon, but there are more demons, meaning to say like, if any drop of blood spills on the ground, that becomes another, sort of a demon. And I think that's how I like to think of our movement. It's like, yeah, I think we're just going to be many, many more of us trying to engage with the system by delaying it as a strategy, like delaying these evictions, delaying this sort of action. I'm sorry, I just, I tend to become a bit like melodramatic sometimes.
No, that's a great metaphor. Other questions? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. You mentioned the G20 summit's impact on the community. How do you think megacities can tie into local culture and equity and sustainability and contribute to building community rather than bulldozing it? Thanks.
Well, I think just going back to the basics of what is considered legal and illegal. So I think this was in Vietnam, in which I think it was Hanoi in Vietnam, in which, and I think Greg, you might know about it. We were looking at it a few years back, in which they changed the definition of what is considered legal, illegal, in which like households which were considered illegal, were not classified as such, and because of that, they could avail access to services like water and sewage, but also like build better, because a lot of time people build poorly because they know that they can't really invest their money in something which is going to be just sort of bulldozed. So I think one has to really go back to those sort of basics of how people are looked at, which is very unequal. And I think it's something as simple as that, really. And secondly, I think when it comes to mega events, we really behave like, if you have guests at home and suddenly you are like hiding away everything, like tucking things under the carpet, sweeping stuff under the carpet, and sort of like hiding away your poorer cousins or just like people in the household you don't want to show to the guests. Like, what kind of behavior is that? But what we need is, of course, systemic sort of solutions, right? If there is a lack of adequate housing, you create more housing. You look at the new housing which is being built in our cities, it is not catering to the people who need that housing. So of course you're going to have slums, and of course you want to just cover them up because you're not thinking of long-term systemic sort of solutions. So I think if we stop knee-jerk reactions to things, but of course it's connected to politics as well. Governments change every 5 years. People want to make loud, visible projects so that they get elected again. And I think, yeah, these are the challenges. So I've answered your question, but I've also created another question in that.
Other questions? Arthur?
Hey, thank you for the talk. The whole G20 preparation and all that you talked about, was that kind of influenced by, I kind of read on like the 2010 Commonwealth Games there in Delhi that received a lot of criticism for preparation and comparison to other edition of the games. Was that part of why that all came together at the G20?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any Indian connection? How do you know about the Commonwealth Games?
He did his research.
Nice, yeah. You're absolutely right about that. And so it was the same approach from the government during Commonwealth Games, which were held in 2010. So nothing has changed after a decade, 13 years, 15 years. It's the same sort of reaction. It's focused on beautification and creating projects which don't really work. But I think when it comes to mega events, this is a discussion which has taken place across the world, right? And a lot of cities have then sort of voted against the governments who have signed up for these mega events. Commonwealth housing was built, which is still lying vacant. It's been, 15 years that housing is on the floodplains, by the way, I have to mention. The farmers are considered encroachers, but there's a whole temple which was built on the floodplains. Commonwealth housing was built on the floodplains. The metro depot was built on the floodplain. And they always change the land use very quickly when it comes to these things. But when it comes to like people who have a very low carbon footprint, who are really like actually adding to sustainability, contributing to the city. I mean, they are considered encroachers. So I think it's really like lopsided priorities. But yeah, we don't seem to have learned much from the Commonwealth Games, which was 13 years back.
So I have, this is Ellen again. I have another question. So, I mean, literally for decades, planning education and architectural education, even in India, even in the global South, has really been emphasizing, community participation, bottom-up planning. I know that, for instance, Slum and Shack Dwellers International, I think, started in India and was adopted by UN Habitat. So, I mean, you went out and worked first for rich people making fancy houses, and then you had a crisis of conscience and changed your entire career path. Why is it that these sort of attitudes about planning and development persist in India when at least professionals definitely get educated in different ways of planning?
I think the problem really is at the education level. Like in my education, like 5 years of architecture, these things were not talked about. The only sort of exposure I had to informal settlements, was one professor, one architect who's changed my life, really, if you think about it. He took an elective. I love electives for saving us, really. And it was this one seminar class, which I attended for one semester, which changed my entire view of how I was looking at things. It was not a part of our education. And, being a star architect is really what everyone wants to do. And no one really talks about working with the people. It's not a part of a curriculum in any way. Okay, there may be some universities in India that focus on that, but really, I think the problem is at the education level. I mean, it's like what is considered aspirational. And even now, the people in the planning authorities, the people who had to open those 30,000 objection forms, they are people I studied with, and they are like pissed off with us. And you're like, actually, I think maybe one seminar professor changed something for me, but otherwise, maybe I would have gone the same route. I'd be working with him and sort of making these development plans in a very sort of top-down way. So I think the problem is actually what you pointed out.
I have to say, I'm shocked because at least where I work in East Africa, that's very different. So, but it doesn't mean that the professional attitudes don't exist, but at least the curriculum has really tried to address these issues. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. I'm drawing this question based on my experience in Bangladesh. So I had my 3 drivers left me because they want to go to village to, help their household for their agriculture.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit surprised that we have like agriculture area within the Delhi city itself. So how do people there like think of the community itself? Like, is it their lens for decades, or they also have this village that they have in mind that they wish to like go back? And it's mostly from my experience about the agriculture. So why did they live there if they have the village that they have in mind, where they can also focus on the like agriculture activity there. And another thing is we really had a hard time acknowledging or identifying who's who within that area, because with this informal settlement we actually found difficulties finding like who's really residing there for like decades. Like some cases, like some people say like I'm here, but they just wanted to have like the privilege or advantage from the development activities. So how it works in India case? In Bangladesh case, it was the union chairman actually have the authority to say that like this guy lives here, and he acknowledged him as a resident, community member, and then like it works. Like he is eligible to get the funding or like subsidy from the development initiative. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the way forward. You work with community leaders, community sort of mobilizers, and I think you always know them. I mean, there's some people who might. I don't think anyone's going to come from outside when there's an enumeration or a survey happening. But there might be people who've only been living there for 3 years or 5 years, as opposed to people who've been living there for 25 years. So, and I think that sort of distinction is possible if you're working, closely with the community and the different representatives. So I think there you're absolutely right on how to go about it. And going back to your question on migration, and so what we're talking about is also cyclical migration. And I think all the people who live in informal settlements, I mean, it's a blanket statement, but okay, let's say most people have a second home, have a home back in the village. And I think that's really what has kept people afloat during crises like COVID. When suddenly like the city was shut down, there was no livelihood opportunity, there was no food even for people. And you might know in India, there was a mass exodus from the cities back to the villages because everyone was returning home because that's your safety net. That's what you've got back. I mean, when you go back, that's the only thing you can really count on with that you've got going for yourself. But then I mean, my family migrated as well. We my parents grew up in a village, and then over time, as they migrated to the city, and then we just stopped going back to the village. And so we are more sort of like the other end of this cyclical sort of migration. And then there are people who are sort of newer, a bit of, I mean, on the fresher side of this spectrum of migration. And yeah, and I think apart from the safety net that the village provides, really, I think it's also important to remember how and why the kind of livelihoods people take in cities. I mean, they are because I mean they come from the livelihoods that they already know. They have the know-how in. Meaning to say, a farmer will move to a city and find it easier to farm in the city. So there are some cities in India that still have farming, like Kolkata, for instance. They have wetlands. 50% of the vegetables come from wetlands. But these are things people don't really know about. But getting back to the question of livelihoods and migration, what's the first thing? I mean, I think about this often. If I move to another city because of my education, I can get the kind of job I want. I can get the kind of house that I want to live in. I can afford to pay rent. But if you are a migrant who just comes from a village, you don't have a lot of resources. One of the first things you do is either you become a street vendor, or you become a waste picker, or you become a farmer, based on either the networks, the social networks that you sort of plug into, right? Because they're already, I mean, it's very strong. You can't just become a waste picker. You only can become a waste picker if you plug into the network of waste picking, which is very region and religion based as well in Delhi. But at the same time, these are things that you can quickly start making a living out of. So I feel like I might have answered like or talked about a lot of things based on what you had started a discussion on. But yeah, everyone has that sort of second home. In Delhi, sorry, in Indian cities, 70% of the population lives in villages. And so I think that's a very strong link that people still have.
And often
And I think similar in
also
Bangladesh.
are split between those locations. People lead these very multi-locational lives.
Yeah, like you mean to say like for every birth or death or a marriage, people are going back and forth, right? That's what you mean.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. That's part of it.
And Greg has done a lot of work in Indonesia and India exactly along these lines, talking about migration and second and third tier cities. So you should pick his brains as well.
They have many opportunities to do that.
Yeah.
Other questions? Swati, I have a question for you. So you spoke a little bit about the fact that many of the communities that you work with don't regularly use or engage with maps, and that this sort of this sort of lived experience of their neighborhoods and their city is very different as a result. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that. When people don't use maps in order to understand space, what do they use? How do they see communities and cities? And is there anything we can take from that as planners who maybe over-rely on maps?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think I can also answer that a bit from the perspective of architecture, because after some time we just stop making architectural drawings because people, I mean, these are very, like, the master plan is a very technocratic piece of document if you think about it. And even architectural drawings, I mean, they're very technical. People don't really understand the plan and the section. And so over time, what we just do now is we make a lot of physical models. We do a lot of role play. A lot of people, they will like walk 10 steps and tell you the length of the room that they want when we're designing something with them, and use like their bodies for conversations. And so over time, yeah, I think we've gone a bit away from this, what should I call it, technical language of drawings. And coming to maps, I think we make maps because the communities that we work with, in their assertion towards the right to be there, the right to the city, they're also looking for legitimacy and credibility. And so maps provide that legitimacy. So we have to, as I said, learn to speak the language of the map and make those maps. But yeah, at the same time, I think there's a lot of knowledge that people have intuitively, a lot of tacit knowledge, which we also need to learn from. So in this whole process of when we were the bridge between the planning authorities and the people, I think the learning was really both ways. And it's not just like people understanding what's in the master plan, but also the master planners understanding, what people want, and also how things can be made even better within the city. As an example, just to kind of, like, master plan is about numbers. It's a very spatial and a physical document. And so when we were working with waste pickers, and so Delhi, big Indian cities have waste picking, where actually the waste pickers who segregate waste into plastic, paper, metal, etc. They're the real recyclers in the city. Of course, it's important to advocate for dignity in that livelihood, but at the same time, what the government is doing is creating waste power plants instead of recycling, and so they are being pushed out of their livelihoods. So the master plan said that for every 10,000 households, there should be one waste segregation point. And so when the waste picker communities that we work with figured it out, they realized that that would mean that the number of waste segregation points in the city would become half. And that means that they would lose, a lot of them would lose their livelihoods. And so they worked out these numbers, of course, like based on a lot of like help from people who could read the master plan, have the technical sort of know-how. And then they put the demand in that, hey, you need to make sure there's a segregation point for every 5,000 households. And so these very sort of like pointed sort of observations, which even the planners appreciated, like the people on the other end, they hadn't thought about these things. They hadn't thought about how one number has such a huge impact on lives of people. And so I think the learning was really both ways because of this engagement. Was that clear, that example?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Was there anything surprising that came out of this engagement process in terms of what people really wanted in their city? I mean, obviously the farmers and the waste pickers want to keep their livelihood, but was there anything that came out of this process that was a surprise?
Well, I don't know about a surprise, but there was a funny incident. Like many things actually work in people's favor as well. They just, they need some time to figure it out. So I was in Savda Ghevra, Savda Ghevra, Greg, which is a resettlement colony where they've got 5-year leases. The plots are only for 5-year leases, 10-year leases, but the 10 years are up and people are still living there. So creating another layer of illegitimacy. Anyway, so the government, so the planning authorities came up with a regulation saying that you can form plots up to 64 square meters. So basically, I think what it would end up doing, when the master plan came into effect, is that people could fuse their plots. Like right now, it was not allowed that you cannot fuse 2 or 3 plots. Like you can't build a bigger house by combining 3 plots together, right? But the master plan was allowing for that legally. And so the people were like, so we were asking people, what do you think? And they're like, no, no, no. That means outsiders will start coming in. They will start buying property. It will get gentrified. The real estate value will go up. And these are all legitimate concerns. But then someone said, hey, but what if we can also start building bigger plots? Like if we work together, then actually this is beneficial for us. This is actually acting in our favor because we can like build bigger houses and also like make more money out of it. Anyway, so the thing is, what we thought might not work in their favor, they realized actually works in their favor. And I think when I'm narrating it, it's not actually as funny as it was in the moment, because yeah, I think you have to look at a situation from all sides, and it can be a bit amusing sometimes.
Yeah, that's an interesting connect to different kinds of gentrification debates that happen here as well, in terms of sort of who benefits when gentrification happens. So, any final questions before we wrap up?
Could you just talk a little bit more about the toolkit and how you came up with the idea?
Can you hear that question, Swati?
Talk a bit more about what?
The toolkit.
Okay. So what aspect of it would you like me to talk about?
Oh, she's asking what exactly you're interested in.
Oh, just like the civic engagement organizing component, like how many colonies did you interact with? What was like the process for it? Any changes you would have made moving forward or doing the toolkit again?
Sorry, can you just repeat the last thing? Greg, what was the last thing?
So it's basically the question is what the engagement process was like to design the toolkit, how the toolkit works, and then if you would have made any changes.
Okay. We actually wrote a paper. Sorry, please go on.
And where to access it if you have like any like documents about it.
Yeah, sure. We actually wrote a paper on it for the Radical Housing Journal. I don't know if you've heard of them. They do some really amazing work. We all speak different languages.
Oh, wait, sorry. We lost you for 1 second. Just start at the beginning of your answer.
Okay. I was saying that we wrote a paper for the Radical Housing Journal. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're like brilliant folks. They do some really good work. And oh wait, I also, talking about brilliant folks, I also want to tell you about, going off at a tangent, but still connected to what I presented, the anti-eviction mapping project. Have you heard of the anti-eviction mapping project in San Francisco and New York? They're doing some brilliant work as well. They basically have been mapping dispossession of households because of gentrification. And again, they do it through mapping. And so some really good work happening in American cities. So Radical Housing Journal talks about similar issues. And I'm happy to share that paper with Greg if anyone wants to have a look. But coming directly back to your question, I can quickly just talk about one of the activities. So we had an activity on housing, activity on services, and an activity on public transport. And it was very important for us to also talk about habitat is an amalgamation of all of them. You know, it can't just be housing, it's also housing and services. And it can't just be housing and services, it's also public transport, right? Because if someone is resettled to the edge of the city, very far removed from their livelihood, then they're going to spend a lot of money going back and forth. And so these are the kind of discussions which were very important for us to have. And so for public transport, we used a lot of like, where are we, where do we travel to, and try to map it. So when we did it in Savda-Ghevra, the resettlement colony, which was, you know, at the fringe, at the margin of the city, it's a very different footprint that the people have on a daily basis when compared to someone who's a bit more inner city. So that was a conversation on public transport. And it also led to a lot of anecdotal evidence, if I can call it that, where women shared with us, like street vendors and waste picker women, that even though bus service is free for women in Delhi, so in the current government has made bus service free for women, but the bus drivers don't stop for them because they see them as low class, you know, low caste. And so, you know, you might have a good policy, but at the same time, you know, the implementation is not there because, well, the person hasn't been sensitized, the bus drivers haven't been sensitized. So these sort of things also came up in our conversations on the toolkit. And going to housing, I think we tried to talk about affordability. And what we were saying is everyone calculated their monthly incomes. And then we asked them for their rent. How much are they paying on the rent? And, you know, we realized that, I mean, it should be affordable housing should be 1/3 of your income. You know, like that's a general sort of rule. If you're spending more 50% of your income on your housing, then of course it's not affordable for you. And if you want to purchase a house, then the rule of thumb is your yearly income into 5. You know, I mean, it should not be more than that, the cost of housing in that area. So there were a lot of mathematical calculations, and that's why we had a slate, like a writing sort of a blackboard. And also we were talking about, of course, like in land tenure. So, you know, you might have affordable housing, but at the same time, you have no guarantee. Like you can't take loan on that housing. So I think talking about these sort of issues and also understanding the different spectrum of housing. The government has a whole metric of different typologies of housing, low income, middle income, high income, which are based on income brackets. And understanding those differences and seeing where you fall in an income bracket, which the government is not building for, absolutely not building for, right? And that is the main objection that you have with the master plan and the fact that it's not building housing for you. So the activities sort of led to these discussions, which are actually very complex, but we try to have them in a more accessible way.
And Swati, if students wanted to actually see the toolkit, is there like a digital version or something that is available?
Yeah. Oh yeah. We love creating open source materials. On our website, there's an open source section. All the different kits, different parts of the toolkit are downloadable. We made a whole manual on the different activities. You can recreate the toolkit yourself. It's in English and Hindi, the local language and English. But yeah, you can read the English part. So everything is out there on our website.
On Social Design Collaborative's website.
Yes, long name, Social Design Collaborative. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Well, we're wrapping up now because we have a class that's slowly infiltrating. It starts at 12:30. But Swati, we're so grateful to you for taking this time to be with us and to share about your work, especially given that it's late in the evening now in India. But I think this has been really inspiring for all of us, and yeah, your perseverance in sort of staying true to your values as an architect and planner and centering equity is definitely something that we can all learn from. So thank you so much, and I'm sure some of the students will be reaching out to you.